I have a confession to make. Sometimes I feel a little bit like a coward. Throughout my life, I can think of almost countless opportunities I had to tell people about Jesus, to make a stand for my beliefs, and I didn't. I let a lot of opportunities to talk about Jesus pass by, or to make it clear that, I stand for this. But I was afraid. I was afraid of, especially as a younger kid, being made fun of. Like other kids can be pretty mean. And if you say, I'm not going to swear because I'm a Christian and that's not something we should do, I got made fun of by my best friend even. I know that there's a dichotomy. That fear, it doesn't really go away when you become an adult, if we're being completely honest. The amount of times in my adult life that I have felt like the Holy Spirit was nudging me to offer to pray for someone or to say something about Jesus, but chose not to listen because I was afraid. I was too afraid to speak up because even as an adult, who wants to be ridiculed or made fun of or thought of poorly? Nobody wants that, right? And the truth is, that might not have happened, but I let my fear that it could happen get the better of me. They say friendship evangelism is one of the most widely acknowledged, and accepted as the best form of evangelism. The idea is that people are more likely to listen to you when they have a relationship with you. But it has its own dangers related to fear. It's very easy to build a friendship and then forget the evangelism part. Because I've experienced this. You start to build a good friendship with the hope of telling this person about Jesus, but then you reach a point where you start to care so much about that relationship, you're afraid saying something about Jesus is going to ruin it. And, it's twisted because a true friend who loves them would say something, but the fear, of being made fun of or losing that friendship sometimes holds us back. Have any of you ever experienced something similar to any of that? Right? Raise your hand. I'd be surprised if someone didn't raise their hand. Maybe you felt the pressure to keep quiet at work about your faith. This isn't the place to talk about that sort of thing. Maybe you've also experienced the fear of what people will think or how they'll treat you. Or maybe you've also been afraid of damaging a relationship by saying something. Maybe you feel pressure to be like everyone else around you. What are we supposed to do with that fear? What are we supposed to do in those situations where it's a risk? We're going to look at some events involving Daniel and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we're going to look at some simple, yet at times dangerous and maybe even difficult actions that they chose to take, and the results, because the results are quite encouraging. Last week in the story, we reached a point where we were learning from Jeremiah. He was the last prophet sent to Judah to warn them. They've been sinning against God and they needed to repent. And God was sending Babylon as punishment and they were going to be taken into exile. Well, now we're in chapter 18 of the story, in the book of Daniel, and it has happened. Babylon has conquered Judah and taken them into exile. Now, Daniel and his friends are some of the young men of Judah that were taken into exile. And they have been selected for a special training program to make them into proper Babylonians, to make them of service to the king, and to train them for important roles. And this does come with some special privileges, as you might imagine, including eating what the king ate and drinking what the king drank. And I don't know if you've ever thought of this, but this was probably the most amazing and exquisite food that these men have ever seen in their lives. Right? Like this would be like you and me, who maybe normally eats like chicken fingers and French fries, going and eating at a billionaire's house who has a staff of caterers and stuff. It would just be night and day. And yet we read a strange choice, at least to me, of Daniel and his friends in Daniel chapter 1, verse 8. It says, "But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the royal delicacies or the royal wine. He therefore asked the overseer of the court officials for permission not to defile himself." You know, he wants to eat vegetables and drink water and things like that. For a second, I want to tell you a different story. There's a Bible scholar named John Goldingay, and he tells an amusing story. He lives in the United States, in California specifically, and there's this British store that he really likes to visit every few weeks. It has an aisle full of British teas, and one full of British jams, one full of British cereals, and a fridge full of, British bacon, pies, and cream. And he says he likes to go because all the food tastes good. But he admits that a large part of the reason they taste good is because they remind him of home. He's British. Now, on one occasion, he got so involved in a conversation with the other British people in the store, including the owner, and then he ended up panicking at checkout because he realized he didn't have any British money. Well, he realized obviously he didn't actually need that, but entering the store and had been like walking around in the UK, in a store in the UK, it took him right back. Now, Goldingay makes it clear that he is in California voluntarily and he loves it there. He is not in a forced exile like Daniel and his friends. Yet he says he will never be able to feel like an American. He will always know he's a resident alien, partly because he has chosen not to seek citizenship. And he says perhaps that's because he wants to preserve his Britishness. And something similar seems to be going on with Daniel and his friends. They want to preserve their Judahite and their Jewish identity. They weren't obliged to avoid eating everything the king ate or to avoid drinking the wine, because not all of it was inherently defiling, right? There might have been some pork or something they couldn't eat, but there would have been a lot of stuff they could have. They chose not to. Why? Well, much like with this British man going into the British store and being surrounded by all the food and things, food can often link with identity. It's actually stranger that they accepted Babylonian names, even though the names make connections to Babylonian gods. Maybe it's just important that they draw the line somewhere, right? You see, you have to avoid the defiling effects of a culture that worships different gods. Now the Babylonians determined their names of these young men without their say. So Daniel is trying to do some determining of his own. Where can I stand out? They are trying to maintain their Jewish identity in some way. They are trying to stand out as Jewish, as Judahites. And you know what? God rewards their efforts for trying to stand out. Verse 17 tells us that God endowed these 4 men with knowledge and skill in all sorts of literature and wisdom. And that God also gave Daniel insight into all kinds of dreams and visions. And that becomes important. In Daniel chapter 2, verses 47 through 48, we read, "The king replied to Daniel, 'Certainly your God is a God of gods and Lord of kings and revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery.' Then the king elevated Daniel to a high position and bestowed on him many marvelous gifts. He granted him authority over the entire province of Babylon and made him the main prefect over all the wise men of Babylon." So sometime after Daniel and his friends stand out by their food choices, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And he doesn't really understand what it means, and it really troubles him. You have to understand that this is a culture that believed dreams carried a lot of significance and could be messages from gods. So Daniel is identified as a man from among the exiles of Judah who can interpret dreams. And so Daniel makes it clear to King Nebuchadnezzar, God is the one doing the revealing. And then he makes the dream known and reveals its meaning. Nebuchadnezzar dreamt of this big statue. Its head was gold, its chest and arms were silver, its belly and thighs were bronze, its legs were iron, and its feet were a mixture of iron and clay. And then this big stone is cut out and comes and crushes the statue and then becomes a large mountain. Different sections of the statue represent different kingdoms. The gold head, everyone acknowledges, is Babylon. But the rest are pretty highly debated. A common opinion is that the others are Medo-Persia, Greece, and then Rome. But we don't know for sure. There's some disagreement. And it doesn't matter that much for what we're doing today. What matters is that with this rock and this mountain, God is also saying he is going to rise up an everlasting kingdom that will bring about the demise of the others. The human kingdoms ultimately all have feet of clay. They all crumble in the face of God's kingdom. Now, after Daniel tells the king all of this, Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges and glorifies God. He praises God, and he elevates Daniel to a high position with authority over the entire province. So we see Daniel stands out on more than one occasion, and God ends up being glorified. Daniel distinguished himself with his choices of eating habits. And he made it clear he was a Jew from Judah, not a Babylonian. And going forward, people recognize that about him. Even when people bring him to the king to interpret dreams, they point out, hey, he's one of the guys from Judah. He stands out. And God uses him and receives glory. Do you stand out as one of God's people, or do you resemble the culture around you? Have you been absorbed into the Canadian culture? Do you just look like everybody else? Is it clear that you are from a different kingdom? Or do you watch what everyone else watches? Do you talk the way everyone else at work talks? Do you look like just another Canadian, American, Dutchman, Irishman, whatever you are? Or do you stand out as different? There is something different about that person. Not long after this, Daniel's friends are tested. Nebuchadnezzar, like many kings in the ancient world, wants to receive all kinds of glory and even be elevated to godlike status. He has this 90-foot tall statue made out of gold, and the Bible isn't clear what the statue is of, but there are a number of ancient authors who seem to indicate that it was a statue representing the deification of Nebuchadnezzar himself. So there's a good chance he has just made a statue of himself that he wants worshipped as a god. Either way, he wants it worshipped. Everyone is assembled, and they are told to bow down to the statue or be killed in a fiery furnace. So then we read in Daniel chapter 3, verse 6, and then in verse 16 through 18, "Whoever does not bow down and pay homage will immediately be thrown into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire." Now, skipping ahead to verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to King Nebuchadnezzar, "We do not need to give you a reply concerning this. If our God whom we are serving exists, he is able to rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will rescue us, O king, from your power as well. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we don't serve your gods, and we will not pay homage to the golden statue that you have erected." Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they know they cannot bow down to this statue. This bowing down meant an act of worship, and they will not participate in idolatry. They will not worship an idol because they worship the one true God. So they refuse to do so, and they are immediately turned in. But when you think about it, it had to be pretty obvious, right? Imagine how much they are standing out. Literally everyone around them is on the ground, their faces to the dirt, bowing. And these three men are standing tall. Nebuchadnezzar is enraged. And he tells them, you're going to have another chance to bow down when the instruments are played, or I'm going to throw you into this furnace. And then he actually goes on and kind of mocks God. He says, "Who is that God who can rescue you from my power?" We know it never goes well when someone challenges God. These three men have a very serious choice to make. Give up and bow down, becoming like everyone else out of fear, or, stand up, quite literally, stand up for God and possibly die. They choose to stand up. They defiantly tell the king, God can and he will rescue us, and even if he doesn't, we don't serve your gods. We are not bowing. Now, this is a fairly popular story in Sunday school classes and in sermons and stuff, so I'm sure we all know how this story turns out. Nebuchadnezzar is so enraged, he has the furnace stoked so hot, it actually kills the guards who throw these three men into it. And while looking in, the king sees 4 men when he only threw 3 in. And he actually says that 4th man, he looks like a god. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are called out, and they come before the king, and they have been untouched by the flames. There's not even any soot on them. Once again, God ends up being glorified by the king and receiving praise and acknowledgement because these men chose to stand up in the face of danger, stand up for their God. Now, this is the kind of choice that we don't tend to face here in Canada. But it is a real choice for many around the world. The Open Doors watch list of the top 50 countries where Christians face heavy persecution says 350 million Christians are facing very high or extreme levels of persecution right now in these top 50 countries. There are a lot more than 50 countries in the world, so the number keeps going up. 1 in 7 Christians are persecuted worldwide. 1 in 5 Christians are persecuted in Africa. 2 in 5 Christians are persecuted in Asia. This past year, so 2024, 4,476 Christians were killed for being Christian. 4,744 Christians were detained or being imprisoned for saying they follow Jesus. 7,679 churches or Christian properties were attacked and destroyed. Fire, bombs, whatever. These people, these brothers and sisters around the world, face a real danger for following Jesus. And despite that, those men and women in prison who were killed, who've had their property destroyed, they chose to stand up for God. Do you stand up for your faith? Or do you stay quiet? It is so easy to stay quiet. And there is no judgment here, because anything negative that you think I'm saying about you, I am also saying about myself. Man, I mess this up all the time. But while people are being killed for standing out and standing up for their faith, are we afraid to stand up in a place where we might receive persecution, but it's nowhere near that bad? At least not yet. Are we willing to be persecuted for standing up, for not bowing down to false gods? For not worshiping money and entertainment or sexual ideologies and gender identities. What else? Are we willing to stand up even at the risk of embarrassment, of job loss, of jail time, even death? There are laws slowly being passed that make some of these things more and more possible. For example, in the last couple years, a bill was passed banning conversion therapy and saying anyone guilty of conversion therapy can go to jail. Now, there is 100% bad, coercive, abusive conversion therapy. But this law also includes, if someone comes to me saying they struggle with homosexual feelings, and I pray with them that they don't struggle with those feelings, under the law, that is counted as conversion therapy, and I could go to jail or be fined. It is slowly becoming more and more risky to stand out or to stand up for what we know is right. Knowing that, will we stand up so that God will be glorified? As followers of Jesus in a country increasingly hostile to Christian values, we need to stand out, as scary as it is. That means being different from those around us. Draw the line somewhere, like Daniel and his friends did. Declare that you are different. I don't necessarily want you to go and do something radical. It can be simple. Maybe you draw a line on the TV shows and the movies you watch. Or maybe you draw the line on the way you speak. The language you use, the jokes you say and laugh at, things like that. Or maybe even the way you dress, right? Or the stores that you're willing to shop at. That store has coercive policies towards its employees, so as a Christian, I take a stand. I draw the line. I'm not shopping at that store, even though a lot of people are going to look at me funny for that. I can't tell you where to draw the line. That is up to you to figure out based on your biblical convictions, your honest desire to serve God and stand out for Him. But I can offer a piece of advice. Ask yourself the question, you've all probably at some point heard the question, what would Jesus do? I actually like it better when you say, what would Jesus do if He were me? If Jesus was living my life in my time, in this situation specifically, what would He do? How can I show the people around me that I am different because I follow Jesus? How can I stand out? And in a culture where morality and truth are becoming increasingly subjective to people, we also need to stand up for God, for truth. We are increasingly told all that matters is being true to yourself. Your truth is different than mine, but it's still true for you. And feelings are the most important thing. If you feel good, if you feel happy, then you're living the right life. Nothing else really matters. As followers of Jesus, we know that there is such a thing as objective truth. True truth. That is always true. God tells us that how we live does in fact matter. And that what we do with our bodies does matter. How we treat people, how we treat refugees, immigrants, the poor, these things matter. Who you follow matters. Right and wrong are real things and they matter. And so, knowing that, we need to stand up for Jesus and for the truth that He gives us. Now, I have something really important to say about that. How we do it matters. Okay? Like Jesus, we are to be people of love. And that does mean telling people the truth, because it is very unloving not to tell people the truth. But it also means that while you're doing it, you are gracious and you are kind to them. That is another way that we stand out and stand up in this world. We don't hate the people that we disagree with. The world teaches that right now. You don't agree with me? That means you must hate me. They are people made in God's image, deserving of love and respect. But they need to hear the truth. We need to stand up for that. And finally, stand firm. Plant your feet on that firm foundation. When you face pressure, and you absolutely will, stand firm. There will be pressure to be quiet, to keep it to yourself. There will be pressure to change your values so that other people are more comfortable. There will be pressure to be like everyone else. I'd be amazed if you haven't experienced it in some way already, but I can guarantee that if you haven't, you will. Stand firm in the foundation that is Jesus. Plant those feet and stay on that solid ground. Now, I know that these actions, these steps that I've given you, they don't exactly help answer the question of how to deal with fear when you take that stand. And that is a hard question. But let me ask you something. Do you think maybe Daniel and his friends, do you think they were afraid of what might happen when they stood up, but they chose to trust God and take that stand anyway? I think they probably were. They're human. And that is the real answer there. It comes down to trust. Being afraid of what will happen is okay. In fact, as a human, it is perfectly normal. The real question is, do you trust God enough to take the stand anyway? Daniel and his friends trusted God, and look at how things turned out. Look at how God responded. He rescued them from the furnace. He elevated them to positions of power, and ultimately he was glorified. Now, I'm not saying if you take that stand, God is going to pull you from a fiery furnace, or he's going to make you the Prime Minister of Canada. Not that anyone would want that job. But I can promise you, whatever happens when you take that stand, God is with you, and God will work it out. And whatever happens, you will be okay. Because God is with you. Just trust God. Trust that he is so, so good. And trust that he cares about you personally. And that he is in control, and he actually knows what he's doing when he tells you to take these stands. Trust that there is a plan and that God will work it all out. Follow that nudging from the Spirit in your heart. Follow the Scripture. Ask that person if you can pray for them, despite the fear of how they'll respond. Respond to someone's complaint with some good advice from the Bible. Mention Jesus to your friend. Acknowledge that you're afraid. Accept it. It's a reality. But then decide, do I truly trust God? And if I do, then do it. Stand out as different. Stand up for Jesus and for truth. And stand firm on that foundation. I'm going to close with 2 Timothy 1, verse 7. For God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and self-control. Live by that Spirit.